You're scrolling through your phone. Suddenly, every news outlet explodes with the same headline. World War III has begun. Nuclear powers are engaged. Missiles are launching. Your city might be a target. You have maybe 15 minutes before everything changes forever. What does your brain do in that moment? Here's what neuroscientists discovered studying populations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When faced with imminent global catastrophe, 83% of people's brains completely shut down rational thinking and default to primitive survival patterns that actually decrease their chances of survival. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal exactly which psychological response your brain would trigger, and why understanding this could literally be the difference between life and death if this nightmare scenario ever becomes reality. Look, I know this is heavy, maybe late at night, maybe when watching the news. And you've probably thought, I'd know exactly what to do. But here's the brutal scientific truth. Your conscious mind has absolutely no ideas how your brain would actually respond to the announcement of World War III. Neurologically, psychologically, behaviorally, you would become almost unrecognizable to yourself. By the end of this video, you'll discover the 7 psychological stages your brain would cycle through in those first critical hours, backed by decades of research on human behavior during existential crises. You'll learn which stage would hit you first based on your personality type. And most crucially, you'll understand how to override your brain's catastrophic default responses. Because this isn't just about war, this is about how your mind functions when everything you've ever known is about to be destroyed. And that knowledge, that's survival. And if you want to keep exploring the darkest, most fascinating corners of human psychology with me here at Your Brain, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we dive into the scenarios that reveal who you really are when pushed to the absolute limit. Let's go deep together. Topic number 1, and we need to talk about the psychological phenomenon that would kill more people than the actual weapons in the first hours of World War III. It's called normalcy bias, and it's your brain's absolute refusal to accept that catastrophe is actually happening. Dr. John Leach, a military survival psychologist who studied human behavior in disasters for over 30 years, discovered something absolutely chilling about how our brains process existential threats. When you see that notification, when you hear those sirens, when the news anchor's voice is shaking as they report missile launches, your brain doesn't go into action mode like you imagine. Instead, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for processing new and threatening information, essentially freezes. Leach's research on disaster survivors revealed that approximately 75% of people enter what he calls behavioral inaction during the first 10 to 15 minutes of a catastrophic event. They literally cannot move, cannot decide, cannot act. This isn't cowardice, and it's not stupidity. It's your brain being so overwhelmed by information that contradicts your worldview that it just stops processing entirely. Think about it. Your entire life you've operated under the assumption that global nuclear war won't happen, that civilization is stable, that tomorrow will basically look like today. That assumption is hardwired into every neural pathway in your brain. It's called your mental model of reality, and it's incredibly resistant to change even when presented with contradictory evidence. During the 1945 atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors reported that even as the mushroom cloud rose, even as buildings vaporized around them, their first thoughts were trying to explain it as something normal. A gas explosion, a conventional bomb, anything except what it actually was. This is your amygdala, your brain's threat detection center, being so overloaded that it actually impairs the very cognitive functions you need to respond. Neuroscientist Dr. Joseph Ledoux's research using brain imaging shows that when the amygdala receives threat information beyond a certain threshold, it doesn't amplify your response. It actually suppresses activity in your prefrontal cortex. You become stupider precisely when you need to be smartest. So in those first minutes of World War III starting, while you desperately need to be making survival decisions, your brain would more likely be sitting there refreshing the news, waiting for someone to say it's a mistake, a hoax, a misunderstanding. You'd be looking at social media to see what other people are saying, hoping someone will tell you it's not real. Meanwhile, the people who survive catastrophic events, the 10 to 15% who immediately take action, are the ones whose brains somehow bypass this normalcy bias. Studies show these people often have prior experience with life-threatening situations, military training, or have specifically practiced mental rehearsal of worst-case scenarios. Their brains have preloaded response patterns that can activate before the normalcy bias takes hold. TWO reveals something profound about human nature that would immediately activate the moment World War III is announced. Your brain would experience an overwhelming, almost uncontrollable urge to find your tribe, your people, your loved ones. This isn't just emotion. This is ancient neurobiology. Dr. Naomi Eisenberger's groundbreaking research using fMRI brain scans at UCLA discovered that social pain and physical pain activate the exact same neural networks in the brain. When you're separated from loved ones during a crisis, your brain processes this as equivalent to physical injury. The anterior cingulate cortex lights up identically whether you're being stabbed or isolated from your family during danger. This is why, in those first moments of World War III starting, your absolute overwhelming instinct would be to get to your children, your parents, your partner, your closest friends. Studies of the 9/11 attacks showed that people's first actions were almost universally attempts to contact or reach family members, often putting themselves in more danger to do so. People ran into the disaster zone trying to find loved ones. This makes evolutionary sense, because for 99% of human history, your survival odds were higher with your tribe than alone. Your brain knows this at the deepest level. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, would flood your system during this crisis. But here's what's fascinating and terrifying. Oxytocin doesn't just make you loving and peaceful. Research by Dr. Karsten Dedrew shows that oxytocin actually increases in-group loyalty while simultaneously increasing out-group hostility. In plain terms, the same neurochemical making you desperately want to protect your family would also make you more suspicious, more aggressive, more hostile toward anyone outside your immediate circle. In the chaos of World War III's beginning, this would manifest as people becoming tribal incredibly quickly. Your neighbors who you've known for years might suddenly feel like threats if they're competing for the same resources or perceived as other in any way. Historical analysis of populations during World War II, particularly during bombing raids and evacuations, shows this pattern clearly. Communities that had lived peacefully for generations fractured along ethnic, religious, and class lines within hours of crisis beginning. Your brain's tribal instinct doesn't care about your modern values or your conscious beliefs about unity and cooperation. When the amygdala detects existential threat, it activates ancient programming that says, trust only your immediate genetic and social group. Everyone else is potential competition for survival resources. THREE addresses what would happen to your decision-making capability in those first hours. And it's genuinely disturbing. Your brain would face an impossible number of critical decisions all at once. And this would create a psychological state called acute decision fatigue that would functionally cripple your ability to choose anything at all. Dr. Roy Baumeister's research on decision fatigue shows that humans have a limited pool of decision-making resources, and when that pool is depleted, which happens shockingly fast under stress, people either make increasingly poor choices or they freeze up completely and make no choices at all. Think about the decisions flooding your brain the moment World War III starts. Do I stay home or evacuate? If evacuate, where do I go? What do I bring? How much can I carry? Do I take the car, or will roads be gridlocked? Should I stock up on supplies first? Which supplies matter most? Water, food, medicine, weapons, cash? How much time do I have? Should I help neighbors or focus solely on my family? Do I trust government instructions or ignore them? Should I go to the designated shelter or hide somewhere else? The list is endless, and every single decision feels life or death because it might actually be Neuroscientist Dr. Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis explains why this is so neurologically devastating. Your brain makes decisions by accessing emotional memories of past outcomes, but in a World War III scenario, you have no past experience to draw from. Your brain is trying to make survival decisions without any somatic markers, any emotional reference points, any learned patterns. This creates what psychologists call a novelty threat cascade, where your brain is simultaneously terrified and completely uncertain about which actions will help versus hurt. Brain imaging studies show that when people face decisions without clear reference experiences, activity in the prefrontal cortex becomes chaotic and disorganized rather than focused and purposeful. You'd feel your mind racing, considering dozens of options, unable to commit to any of them. And here's where it gets worse, because you know the stakes are ultimate. The pressure to make the perfect decision becomes paralyzing. Dr. Barry Schwartz's paradox of choice. Research demonstrates that when stakes are perceived as very high, people become dramatically worse at choosing because they're trying to optimize rather than satisfy. You'd waste precious minutes, maybe hours, trying to figure out the absolute best course of action when any action would be better than none. Historical accounts from populations who survived the early stages of World War II describe this exact paralysis. People stood in their homes debating what to do until bombs were literally falling, until enemy forces were in their streets, until it was too late to do anything effective. Topic 4 is about the behavior that would emerge almost instantly and create secondary catastrophes beyond the war itself. The moment World War III is announced, your brain would shift into what evolutionary psychologists call competitive resource acquisition mode, and for most people, this manifests as panic buying and hoarding on a scale that would make COVID-19 look like a practice run. Dr. Stephen Taylor, clinical psychologist and author of The Psychology of Pandemics, spent decades studying mass panic behavior and discovered something crucial about the hoarding instinct. It's not primarily driven by rational assessment of needs. It's driven by 3 deep psychological factors: the need for control in an uncontrollable situation, social proof and competitive anxiety when seeing others hoard, and what he calls zero-sum resource thinking, where your brain becomes convinced that anything someone else takes is something you can't have. Within the first hour of World War III being announced, stores would be absolutely mobbed because everyone's brain would simultaneously reach the same conclusion that they need supplies now. But here's what's psychologically fascinating and disturbing. Research on consumer behavior during crises shows that people don't hoard what they rationally need. They hoard what gives them psychological comfort and what they see others hoarding. During World War II rationing, people hoarded sugar and coffee excessively. Not because these were survival necessities, but because they represented normalcy and comfort. Your ventral striatum, the brain's reward center, activates strongly when acquiring desired resources, even if those resources aren't actually useful for survival. So, in a World War III scenario, you'd likely see people fighting over things like alcohol, cigarettes, chocolate, even as they neglect genuinely critical supplies, like water purification tablets or first aid supplies. And the hoarding would become competitive and aggressive incredibly quickly because your brain's scarcity response doesn't just make you want to acquire resources, it makes you want to acquire more than others. Dr. Neuroscience's research on competitive consumption shows that when people perceive scarcity, they don't just take what they need. They take as much as they possibly can because the primitive brain calculates that having excess provides trading power and security. This is why you'd see people with shopping carts absurdly overloaded, people buying 50 cans of food when they could only carry 10, people clearing entire shelves even knowing they can't use everything. And if stores tried to impose limits, studies show that this actually increases hoarding behavior because limits trigger psychological reactance, the brain's resistance to restrictions on freedom. Violence would break out in stores and distribution centers within hours, because when people are in survival mode and competing for resources, the prefrontal cortex's impulse control gets overridden by the amygdala's aggression response. Security camera footage from even minor crisis events like hurricane preparations show people physically fighting over supplies, and that's when they're not facing potential nuclear annihilation. Topic 5 addresses what would happen to your information-seeking behavior, and it reveals how the modern digital age would make the psychological impact of World War III exponentially worse than any previous conflict. Your brain would become absolutely addicted to consuming information about the war, checking updates compulsively every few minutes, and this would create a neurological and psychological nightmare. Dr. Daniel Levitin, neuroscientist specializing in information processing, has documented that when humans face uncertain threats, the brain enters what he calls compulsive information-seeking mode, where you become locked in a loop of consuming more and more information, trying to achieve certainty that's impossible to achieve. The dopamine system that normally rewards information gathering goes into overdrive during crisis because your brain calculates that the right piece of information might save your life. But here's the problem. In World War III, information would be contradictory, unreliable, weaponized, and overwhelming. You'd be scrolling through social media, seeing videos that might be current footage or might be from video games or previous conflicts. You'd be seeing government statements that contradict each other. You'd be seeing expert predictions ranging from "this will be resolved diplomatically" to "nuclear winter in 48 hours", and your brain would consume a LL of it, unable to stop, unable to determine what's true. Neuroimaging research by Dr. Russell Poldrack shows that information overload actually impairs the hippocampus's ability to consolidate information into useful knowledge. You'd be consuming so much that you'd retain almost nothing useful. And this is where conspiracy theories would absolutely explode, because when faced with terrifying uncertainty, the human brain craves explanatory narratives, even if those narratives are completely false. Dr. Jan Willem van Peruijen's research on conspiracy belief shows that conspiracy theories spike dramatically during crises, because they provide a sense of understanding and control. If you can believe that World War III is actually a false flag operation, or that it's all theater, or that there's a secret plan to save everyone, your brain feels less helpless than if you accept the chaotic reality that global powers are actually trying to destroy each other. Social media algorithms would make this infinitely worse because they're designed to maximize engagement. And extreme emotional conspiracy content is incredibly engaging. So, your feed would become increasingly detached from reality, showing you more and more extreme theories, connecting you with communities of people, reinforcing those theories, creating echo chambers of increasingly bizarre beliefs. Studies of online behavior during COVID-19 showed how quickly people could be radicalized into believing completely fabricated narratives when algorithms fed them confirming content. In World War III, this would happen even faster and more intensely. You'd have people convinced that nuclear explosions were holograms, that world leaders were already dead and replaced with clones, that the whole thing was orchestrated by shadowy groups. And the scariest part is that some people would make survival decisions based on these conspiracy beliefs, decisions that would get them killed, like refusing to evacuate because they believe it's a government trap, or traveling toward danger zones because conspiracy theorists online said those areas are actually safe. Topic 6 is the darkest and most disturbing psychological phenomenon that would emerge in World War III, and it's about how quickly your moral framework would erode under existential pressure. Research by psychologist Dr. Jonathan Haidt and neuroscientist Dr. Joshua Green using brain imaging has revealed something profoundly unsettling about human morality. It's not as fixed and principled as we'd like to believe. It's actually highly contextual and vulnerable to being overridden by survival instincts. When your brain perceives genuine threats to your survival or your family's survival, activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with moral reasoning, gets suppressed while activity in the amygdala and basal ganglia, regions associated with threat response and self-preservation, increases dramatically. In practical terms, this means that moral decisions that seem absolute to you right now, like "I would never steal" or "I would never hurt an innocent person," would become extremely flexible under World War III conditions. Studies of populations during World War II, the Rwandan genocide, the Bosnian War, and other conflicts show consistent patterns of ordinary people committing acts they would have considered unthinkable before the crisis. This isn't because they were secretly evil. It's because the brain under extreme threat literally recalculates moral equations. Dr. Green's trolley problem. Experiments using fMRI scans show that when people are stressed or threatened, they make increasingly utilitarian calculations, sacrificing the few for the many, or more accurately, sacrificing others for themselves and their immediate group. In World War III, this would manifest in ways most people don't want to imagine. If you came across a shelter that was full but you could force your way in by displacing someone else's family, would you do it? If you found supplies but taking them meant another family wouldn't have enough, would you take them anyway? If helping a stranger meant putting your children at risk, would you help them? Under normal conditions, your conscious moral values would guide you toward ethical choices. But Dr. David Rand's research on decision-making under time pressure shows that when people must decide quickly under stress, moral considerations essentially disappear and pure self-interest dominates. World War III would be nothing but quick decisions under extreme stress. Historical documentation from wars and genocides shows that neighbor turns on neighbor. Friends betray friends, and communities that lived peacefully for generations descend into violence with shocking speed when survival resources become scarce and authority structures collapse. This happens because your brain's moral reasoning is actually quite fragile and dependent on stable social structures and abundance. When those disappear, so does much of the behavioral restraint that we call morality. And perhaps most disturbing, research shows that people retain the language of morality even as their behavior becomes increasingly amoral. They justify selfish actions with moral reasoning, saying they had to do it for their family, they had no choice, anyone would have done the same. Your brain is incredibly good at post hoc rationalization, creating narratives that preserve your self-image as a good person even while your actions contradict that image. Topic 7 is about the psychological phenomenon that historically has been both the most tragic and, paradoxically, sometimes the most adaptive response to World War III scenarios. It's called learned helplessness, and it represents your brain essentially giving up. Dr. Martin Seligman's groundbreaking research on learned helplessness started with animal studies but has been extensively documented. In humans facing overwhelming circumstances, when your brain is exposed to situations where nothing you do seems to make a difference, where outcomes appear random and uncontrollable, it stops trying. Activity in the dorsal raphe nucleus and the locus coeruleus brain regions that generate motivation and arousal becomes suppressed. Serotonin and norepinephrine systems dysregulate. You enter a state of passive acceptance. In World War III, particularly if nuclear weapons are involved, many people's brains would rapidly calculate that their actions are irrelevant to outcomes. If missiles are launching, if cities are being vaporized, if radiation is spreading, what does it matter if you go to the shelter or stay home? What difference does your individual survival plan make in the face of potential human extinction? This calculation would lead millions of people into a state of passive waiting, and historical records from previous wars show this clearly. During the London Blitz, after weeks of bombing, many people stopped going to shelters and just stayed in their homes during raids. Not out of bravery, but out of psychological exhaustion and helplessness. During the atomic bombings of Japan, survivors described people who just sat down in the streets amid the devastation and waited to die. Not because they were physically incapable of moving, but because their brains had shut down the motivation to try. Neuroscientist Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research on stress and the brain shows that prolonged, uncontrollable stress literally causes the hippocampus to atrophy while the amygdala becomes hyperactive, creating a brain state where you're simultaneously anxious and unmotivated, terrified but passive. You'd feel intense fear but be unable to convert it into action. And, in some ways, this learned helplessness could be psychologically protective because, if death is genuinely inevitable, the brain that accepts this might suffer less than the brain fighting desperately against the inevitable. Studies of terminal patients show that those who reach acceptance experience less psychological distress than those who continue fighting when fighting is futile. But the tragedy is that learned helplessness also prevents people from taking actions that could help, from finding solutions that do exist, from surviving situations that are survivable. Research on disaster survivors versus victims consistently shows that the people who survive are often those who maintain agency and belief in their ability to influence outcomes, even when objectively those odds look terrible. Dr. Al Siebert's research on survivor personalities found that resilient people have what he calls stubborn optimism, an arguably irrational belief that their actions matter even in chaotic circumstances. This belief keeps the prefrontal cortex engaged, keeps the brain problem-solving, prevents the descent into helplessness. So, in World War III, learned helplessness would be one of the biggest psychological killers because it would cause people to give up who didn't have to accept death that wasn't inevitable, to stop fighting for survival when survival was still possible. Alright, I need you to be honest in the comments. Which of these 7 psychological responses do you think would hit you first if World War III started tomorrow? Would you freeze in normalcy bias? Would you panic hoard? Would you descend into information addiction and conspiracy spirals? Really think about it, because self-awareness is the first step toward being able to override these patterns. And if this video gave you genuinely new insight into how your brain works under ultimate pressure, hit that like button because it helps your brain reach more people who need to understand the psychology of survival. Knowledge like this isn't just interesting, it's potentially life-saving. Here's the truth that keeps me awake some nights. World War III might actually happen in our lifetimes. The geopolitical tensions are real. The weapons exist. The historical patterns suggest that major global conflicts happen with disturbing regularity. And if it happens, everything we just discussed will activate in your brain whether you want it to or not. But here's the small piece of hope I can offer you. Knowing these psychological patterns gives you a chance, just a chance, to recognize them when they're happening and interrupt them. If you can notice yourself freezing in normalcy bias, you can force action. If you can notice yourself descending into information addiction, you can disconnect and focus on concrete preparation. If you can notice your moral framework starting to erode, you can consciously hold on to your values. Awareness doesn't make you immune to these responses because they're hardwired neurology, but it gives you a fighting chance to stay more human, more rational, more capable than your default brain state would allow. And maybe, just maybe, that slight edge is the difference between surviving and not surviving, between maintaining your humanity and losing it, between adapting and surrendering. Your brain is simultaneously your greatest survival tool and your biggest psychological vulnerability. Understanding which is which in any given moment, that's the ultimate skill. Thank you for going deep into this dark scenario with me today. Remember, we explore these extreme situations not to create fear, but to build understanding. Stay curious, stay prepared, and let's hope we never have to put this knowledge to the test. Your brain out.